Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our live lunchtime show on Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber as we cover the Sean Combs criminal trial. As I said, they're currently in a lunch break, which gives us an hour to really dissect what has happened today and so far in this case. We're going to be taking your questions on YouTube, so submit them if you have questions about today's testimony, about what's been happening in the case, what you expect is going to happen. We talk about how Kid Cudi planning to testify this week. That's going to be pretty big. Submit them. We'll talk about it. And also, as soon as they go back live in court, since there are no cameras, we're going to give you real-time updates about what's happening and break it down in real time. But before I get into all that, I want to bring on right now Law and Crimes reporter Elizabeth Milner, who is inside that courtroom. We have limited time with Elizabeth. I know she has to jump right back in there. Elizabeth, good to see you. Talk to us about the day, how it started with the continuation of the testimony of this special agent from Homeland Security that was part of the raids that were conducted on Sean Combs' property, and what evidence was found, or potential evidence. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, this testimony is something I myself have been very interested in. And this is no offense to all the witnesses that have been testifying, but I really just wanted to see the physical evidence and see especially what was found in those raids. And so Homeland Security Investigation Special Agent Jared Gammon, he took the stand actually yesterday afternoon, and he at first kind of started going over some of the exhibits, especially what was found in the Miami home, and that's the home on Two-Star Island, So they didn't talk about the LA homes or anything like that as far as what was found in that particular home. Really was just focusing on the Miami estate, essentially, because it's a huge property. And so we found out yesterday that 80 to 90 officers were involved in this search, and a lot of the stuff from today was a little just kind of continuation about everything that was found. So we saw a lot of exhibit photos, and I took, Jesse, a lot of notes, because at this point it was just so many exhibits back to back to back to back that you just were so overwhelmed by everything that was found, essentially. And so we learned yesterday that there were AR-15s inside the Miami property with the scratched off serial numbers. We saw that there were platform high heels that were 7 inches tall inside this Miami home. There were sex items inside this home found in the primary bedroom closet. There were then we got a close up of the red high heels and the sex toys, and then these high heels were actually displayed in front of the jury. So Special Agent Gannon, he just took up the heels, kind of showed them to the jury, then put them back into the evidence box, and then kind of had it with the rest of the evidence. And so they said more than a dozen high heels were actually seized from this property. Then we saw some shoes, we saw some boots in the primary closet, and these were special boots. They were Balenciaga boots that I myself cannot necessarily afford. But inside these boots were 3 cell phones. Diddy didn't have much reaction during this testimony, but it was interesting that these cell phones were found in these Balenciaga boots that were inside the closet. And so we also saw a black Gucci bag that was also found inside the closet, and inside that Gucci bag was pills, a powder substance. There was also eye drops in the bag. And so, you know, that Dr. Seuss kind of story, red fish, blue fish, all that stuff, that was essentially kind of the same thing with pills. And I'm not making light of the situation. There were pink pills, there were white pills, there were yellow pills, there were black pills, there were blue pills, there was a crystallized substance. So inside that Gucci bag, some of the residue found inside actually tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. And then they saw a black straw that was also found in this Gucci bag. It also tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. We saw the Lumify eye drop label, the Lumify eye drop label bottle. So initially, I was thinking these were just regular eye drops, but turns out that these eye drops actually tested positive and contained MDMA as well as ketamine. Then we saw a plastic container top. It had kind of the label on it, DBL wash, and that tested positive for cocaine. It was a lot of stuff, Jesse, that we were seeing inside these exhibit photos. A lot of these were pills, tested positive for MDMA. 3 orange pills with a triangular shape that were referred to or had a Tesla label on them. Those tested positive for MDMA. We saw 6 rectangular tablets. Those tested positive for alprazolam, aka Xanax. We saw more Xanax pills in there. We saw a $100 bill that was rolled up that tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. We saw a blue tablet that tested positive for meth and MDMA. Another blue pill that had the same test results. We saw more Xanax pills. Then we get into the master bathroom and we see more exhibit photos. So we see an exhibit photo of the master bathroom and a close-up of this wooden box. And this wooden box had the kind of inscription on top labeled Puffy. And so we got to see what was inside that box. More clear pills, a crystallized substance in that box, and then these capsules that were called golden teachers. And I was like, what are golden teachers? And they are actually mushroom capsules. And so those were displayed to the jury. We saw Ziploc bags of a purple solid crystallized type of material that tested positive for MDMA, ecstasy, as well as Molly. We see more kind of labels of what was going on inside the home in just different rooms, such as we saw zoomed in bottles of baby oil and Astroglide. The special agent said that he had seized 25 bottles of baby oil and 31 bottles of Astroglide from the home, but he said that there was actually more baby oil and more Astroglide that was found. We saw the master closet, which had this vital honey. They didn't go too much into the explanation of what this vital honey actually is. We saw the layout of the guest house, and then we see a handgun as well, too, that was in one of the utility closets in a suitcase. It was a .45 caliber handgun. They displayed the handgun in court today, and they also seized the magazine ammunition for this .45 caliber handgun. They displayed this magazine to the jury again, as well as the handgun, and then we saw the box of ammo as well too. So Jesse, it was a lot of stuff, and I'm really just not even scratching the surface of just every single exhibit photo that we saw, but it was just a lot of, it was either a lot of drugs, a few kind of guns, because we had the AR-15s again with the scratched off serial number, something that we had known about for a while now, but it was a lot of stuff, but a very interesting testimony, but not seeing too much really reaction from Diddy when all of this evidence was being displayed in court today.
Because it might not seem on its face how it's relevant to the case. I think it's relevant to the racketeering charge. Remember, one of the possession with intent to distribute is one of the underlying predicate crimes, of racketeering. So having these materials, or allegedly having these materials and the guns, go to this idea of, a criminal enterprise. And I'll talk more about it. And I understand on cross-examination, the defense focused on the fact that Combs wasn't there during the raids. There was no evidence that he was holding or using the guns. They criticized the level of force. Talked about fingerprints that could have been obtained from the weapons. I want to talk actually about Dr. Dawn Hughes before I let you go. Dr. Dawn Hughes, right, this forensic psychologist, testified in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. We knew she was going to take the stand in support of understanding Cassandra Ventura Fine's actions during this 11-year relationship, not leaving during this relationship, to help her credibility. What did we learn from Dr. Dawn Hughes' testimony so far today?
Yeah, we kind of learned a lot, especially for people who may not be familiar with her work or who speak to forensic psychologists necessarily every single day. And so we learned a little bit just from her perspective on just kind of the role she would be providing as far as testimony goes. And so she was going to be touching on points such as why do individuals stay in domestic violence relationships? Why is there this delayed disclosure, and even just kind of recalling memories from traumatic events. And so, when they were kind of establishing the foundation before her testimony, the prosecution just kind of came out forthright and just said that essentially that she was being compensated for her testimony today, $6,000 just to testify, which is a lot of money. I'm not going to lie about that. But as far as just more of just what she was talking about just about physical abuse, and when victims are hit, that their reaction normally is fear, and so they sometimes have that pattern of they sometimes have a hard time breaking that pattern. Then she got into physical abuse and how physical abuse, I said physical again, I meant psychological abuse. That psychological abuse is all about threatening physical violence, and that for the most part, victims are kind of walking on eggshells, and these symptoms kind of include depression, PTSD, anxiety, Then she got into sexual abuse and how that is a private harm, and just some of the highest types of traumatic stress go into that, and that a lot of victims actually experience shame when it comes to sexual abuse. She touched base on emotional abuse as well too, and she had said when we when we belittle and demean and put down our partner, that kind of falls into emotional abuse. If you can't talk about what's happening, how can you necessarily get help? She talked about financial kind of constraints as far as why victims may not leave because of financial reasons. And then she had said that you need tangible reasons to leave. So how do you leave if you don't have tangible resources? And so that was kind of the basis, because there were a lot of objections today, Jesse.
I'm sure.
Despite the defense saying that they weren't going to have a bunch of objections. But one of the cool things I would say about the cross-examination is that we got to see Jonathan Bach actually kind of in action for the first time. He's one of Diddy's newest attorneys. I think he makes attorney number 9. And so I was kind of wondering during the cross-examination, because we did get to that before the lunch break, but whether or not these jurors were kind of like, who is this guy and why is he showing up on day 8 of trial? And so I was kind of curious what was going through their mind on seeing this new face today.
Hopefully they're not reading the news and trying to figure out what's going on. Listen, Elizabeth, I know you have to jump back in court. Thank you so much. We'll catch you later. Appreciate it.
Yes. Thanks, Jesse.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're getting to your questions online. Submit them on YouTube. I have a panel of great guests. I'm going to break down everything we just heard. Why is it relevant to the case? Why is it relevant to the charges? Stay with us here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. So we have this live lunchtime show in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case. We just heard from Elizabeth Milner, who was inside that courtroom talking about the day's activities, about a special agent from Homeland Security talking about what was found at one of Sean Combs' properties. We're talking about the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes, this psychologist who was brought to the stand by the prosecution, talking about coping strategies, talking about why victims stay with their abusers. Really interesting testimony. A little bit of the cross as well. So we're going to be taking your questions for the next hour or so. Submit them on YouTube. We'll answer them here, but I'm not going to do it alone. I'm here with former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Florina Altshiler. Oh, great to see you. You're getting the first question because you came into studio. Thank you so much, Florina. But I love Jeremy Evans, and I love Joe Richardson, too, and they're going to be with us, too. Joe is a civil rights attorney. Jeremy Evans is a sports, entertainment, and media attorney. Great to have you all here. But, Florina, I'm going to start with you. So the first question that we have is, this is from Tia215 Aisha. Are they bringing Cassie back to the stand, Jesse? No. No, her testimony's done. She's 8.5 months pregnant. They wanted to make sure she finished her entire testimony week one. The judge was adamant about that.
That is absolutely correct. They wanted to get her in, get her out, and be done, and I don't see how she's going to be brought back.
Is that a problem for the prosecution or defense, that they can't recall her?
I think that they've sufficiently established what they needed to establish with her, and there really is not a reason to recall her unless some witness later on brings something up that she potentially can then rebut that has not yet come in. And they would need to address that then, but I don't see how they get her back.
We have a question regarding the forensic testimony. So as I mentioned, Dr. Dawn Hughes, the psychologist, has took the stand earlier. I believe she's still going to be cross-examined when they come back. By the way, when they come back, we're going to give you real-time updates about what's happening in court, and we will break down the testimony in real time. But as I mentioned, she testified in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. One of the things she's discussing today are why victims stay, psychological bonds, the consequences, levels of fear, what psychological violence is, the effects of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, something called love bombing. Somebody just showers somebody with gifts and compliments to keep them in a relationship. Coping mechanisms, minimization, very important factors to talk about, because again, the question is, Cassandra Ventura claims she's a victim of sex trafficking. But why did she stay for 11 years? Why did it seem that there was evidence she was setting up these freak-offs and encouraging these freak-offs? There might be alternative explanations, and it might not be so easy for the jury just to accept she's not telling the truth. So here's the thing. I'll go to you, Joe. We have a question from Jesse K. How can there be two forensic psychologists testifying for each side? Shouldn't there be just one, i.e. the true explanation of trauma response and coping mechanisms, and not two versions of it? I mean, look, we don't know who the defense expert, we know who the defense expert's going to be. The name actually escapes me at the moment, but don't know exactly what they're going to testify to yet. But fair question. Why have so many different experts testify about this?
Well, my dad once told me it's better to have and not need than to need and not have. This is a complicated thing, and the prosecution knows, frankly, they have some explaining to do. There's a lot of people that might disagree with someone being in a relationship that's violent, that's abusive, etc. But everybody knows somebody that's been in that category. What they don't know is that, and what they've never thought of, and what the step that has to happen for this prosecution is that the jury's got to see that there's criminal acts involved with this happening. And so it may be that these two experts are dealing with two sides of the coin, two parts of the world, to be able to make sure that they explain everything that needs to explain. They need to explain and cover all bases, because I think there's an admission here that this is very complicated, because this is not something that people see. People are used to domestic violence. That doesn't mean that there's a criminal conspiracy. That doesn't mean that there's racketeering. That doesn't mean that there are RICO violations. So they've really got to do what they need to do to put it together, so that despite the things that Cassie was actually saying about being in love, being in a wonderful relationship, wanting to do the freak-offs, etc., that they take away that voluntary element, so that what can be left over is the crime that they are alleging, the crimes that the prosecution are alleging took place here.
And put aside the fact that somebody like Cassie could arguably have agreed to this 95 times, but the 5 times she didn't agree to it, And if you're talking about the 2016 hotel incident, for example, or where she claims she was on a plane and shown videos of freak-offs and then felt trapped and then was pressured afterwards to have a freak-off with Diddy, you could say those are instances that are not consensual and make up sex trafficking, although this is complicated. It's a gray area. Jeremy, we have a question for you from Mahogany29. Did Kid Cudi testify yet? No, he didn't testify yet. I know he didn't testify yet, but let me expand the question to you. What are you expecting from his testimony, Jeremy?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think the close relationship and the dispute, amongst the parties, I think clearly leads that, and then the potential that the car was going to be firebombed. I think a lot of these things, kind of like with what Joe was talking about, when you sort of include in the guns and the drugs and everything else that's been going to be put into evidence, and you put in this fact that, Diddy was potentially trying to firebomb a car based on a relationship. I think that's the sort of evidence that would need to go to a RICO charge. They're so rare in terms of coming against celebrities, but it's something that prosecutors have been more willing to do. So I think if anything, the testimony is going to try to go more towards that RICO charge.
Yeah, because arson, so blowing up the car, is one of the predicate crimes, the underlying crimes that the prosecution's hoping to prove there. And by the way, when Cassandra Ventura came out with her lawsuit in 2023, first mentioning this instance or allegation about Combs blowing up Kid Cudi's car, Kid Cudi's team came forward and released a statement basically to the effect saying all of this is true. So he's probably going to testify to something like that. Florina, question for you from Jacqueline Thompson. So we talked about today, there was a special agent discussing all the raids and what was found at the properties. One question, do any of you think the feds hyped this up? It's a serious question. With the heeled shoes, the ducks, the oil, I'm not, you know what I mean? I guess the question is, was there too much there for the raids? I mean, how much does it tie into everything we're talking about?
Well, we're not talking about 1 or 2 bottles of oil. We're talking about massive, massive quantities of oil. And cumulatively taken together between the oil and the toys, it just goes to support the story of these freak-offs being a thing, being an ongoing thing, and each piece of evidence corroborates and supports the credibility of the women who are testifying to these facts. So it's not just them saying he used oil, there's the oil.
And all the drugs, again, one of the underlying crimes of racketeering, possession with intent to distribute. If he's got all the drugs, so it not only goes to the narrative put forward by the prosecution that he would drug victims to keep them compliant. If you're talking about a criminal enterprise engaged in a massive amount of criminal activity, having all those drugs and the guns definitely feeds into that narrative. Joe, I'll go to you. This is from Legs7K. Legs7K has been with us, I think, for every one of the live streams. So thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for coming in and checking us out. Hi, studio. I apologize if this is wrong, but Cassie has given evidence. What about the other male who pressed charges, Lil Rod, I think? Will he be testifying, do you think? Now, he didn't press charges. He filed a lawsuit against Sean Combs. I don't believe he's going to testify, Joe, right? Because I remember in a pretrial filing, the defense had mentioned producer 1 will not be testifying. And if you read between the lines, it looked like Lil Rod. So he showed up outside of court for week 1, but I don't think he's going to be testifying, right? And if he doesn't testify, because he made racketeering allegations himself, sex trafficking allegations himself, if he doesn't testify, does that mean his claims aren't legit?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like he's going to testify, and the prosecution has to decide who's going to really help us get over the line here. And they've made a decision that that particular potential witness, there's not going to be enough happening there. The fact that somebody has filed a civil complaint with the different standards of proof, et cetera, there's 20 to 30 of those now, right? So that doesn't mean that just because they filed those things, Cassie is the one with a mountain of credibility in terms of having filed this case. And they largely based their criminal case on the things that she said in her civil case to support what they'd already done, the work that they had already done, the investigation that they'd already had. The fact that there's a whole lot of other people, whether you want to call them copycats, whether their cases are totally legit or not, they're civil cases. they're not criminal cases. And so the standard, of course, is higher. We got to go beyond a reasonable doubt. So the prosecution has to be very, very picky about who helps them put together the pieces to get over the line as it pertains to this criminal RICO matter. It's not a civil matter. This happened and it shouldn't have, because they could be true, but it doesn't mean that he's going to be convicted. And so they're making decisions about who it is that's going to testify the best, who's going to give them the most. My sense is they probably want as many women to testify as possible. I mean, I would imagine that, and just decided that that particular witness wasn't going to be one of them.
Well, I'll tell you what, one of the reasons people have so much interest in this case is the celebrity factor. Who's going to be named? Who might be called as a witness? Jeremy, we got a question here from Mikey John. Hi, Jesse. Do you think we will see Usher, Neo, or Jimmy Iovine on the stand, or any other celebrities who might have witnessed Sean Combs' crimes? Because we know the testimony this past week suggested, this is from Dawn Richard, that Usher, Neo, others, they had witnessed Sean Combs attack Cassandra Ventura, punch her, or allegedly punch her. You think we're going to see those kinds of names take the stand?
I don't think so. And I think if they did call them to the stand, it would be as a defense witness to defend against, Sean Combs. But I do think that it's interesting because we would obviously know in advance as to what witnesses were being called. So even if we don't know them now, there would have to be some sort of notice provided as to who that particular witness would be. And to a point that Joe is making too, I think we also have to consider the civil aspect of this, because even if Diddy is not convicted for the crime, he could clearly be sued for civil damages, as we sort of saw in the O.J. Simpson case and in others.
We've got a question for you, Florina, from Lami Mami. Lami Mami, great name. If convicted, how many years would Diddy have to face at least?
It depends on which charges he's convicted of,
Right.
but he is looking at very serious time with mandatory minimums that are going to involve federal prison. This is not the type of crime where he's going to get probation or a suspended sentence. If he's convicted of all of the charges, we're looking at serious double-digit
And potentially life in prison.
Right.
Sex trafficking is minimum 15 years in prison. You know, transportation to engage in prostitution is a max of 10 years in prison. Which let me follow up that question up with something else. A lot of talk about would he have taken a deal? Was he offered a deal? Maybe offered a deal, rejected it. What would a deal have looked like in this case? And by the way, what would a deal have looked like before trial? And what could a deal look like in the middle of trial? Although it seems unlikely he's going to plead guilty.
With federal sentencing guidelines, the feds really don't offer great deals. You can reduce your sentence by a number of months, but if someone is looking at a potential of life in prison and looking at a minimum of 15 years, they're not offering him something that's a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 years. I would expect if they did make an offer that the offer would have been something in the double digits in
like
terms
10
of
years
prison
or
time.
something. Yeah.
Right. And oftentimes somebody without a significant criminal record who has not spent years in prison, that's a serious number. And so they're going to think that they could hire a great trial team and maybe beat the charges.
I think that's one of the reasons he rushed towards trial, right? Any federal case would take a while. I mean, to have a trial happen within less than a year of arrest and indictment when there's superseding indictments and it's a racketeering case, if he had made bail, he would have pushed this trial out as far as possible. I'm still convinced of that. Okay. So they are back from court. I'm giving everybody updates about what's happening. The prosecutor says, Your Honor, we emailed you the exhibit over the break, and Mr. Agnifilo, Mark Agnifilo, who's Sean Combs' attorney, one of his attorneys, we object to it as hearsay. The statement, thank you, I feel you from, this is weird. Thank, I feel you from Mr. Combs is ambiguous. He could be saying thanks for the advice. Not entirely clear what this is about. Continue on, one other update from court. We'll pick it up after Dr. Hughes. This is what the judge says. Please get her back on the stand. So now she is entering, the jury's entering, and Mr. Bach, who is one of the new additions to Sean Combs' defense counsel, says, you are with the American Psychology Association, which says you should only render an opinion after an examination, right? And Dr. Dawn Hughes says, we're. So that's interesting, Jeremy, right? They're going to her, not necessarily her qualifications, but they're going to the credibility of her opinions in this case regarding why victims don't leave their abusers and coping mechanisms and things of that nature. That feels like where they need to go with this cross-examination.
No, I completely agree, and I think the reason for that is the amount of times that it occurred. It'd be one thing if it was one or two times, right, that these parties engaged in the freak offs, but ultimately these were occurring, 50, 60, 70 to 90 times. So I think her testimony is so important in that regard, because she's going to be able to show that in abusive relationships, the tendency is for the victim to blame themselves. And also I could imagine some of the defense strategy would be that the victims decided to stay in because they were scared of him, scared of the firebombing, with Kid Cootie's car and everything else that was going on, the guns in the house, the drugs, not to mention the lack of a mental state if you're under the influence. So her testimony is maybe one of the most important in this case.
Joe, I'm going to throw a question to you that we've gotten a lot this past week. It is a fair question. If we're talking about a racketeering conspiracy that Combs had to agree with at least one person to further racketeering activity, illegal activity, that he had his associates and his bodyguards and his assistants help carry out crimes and cover up crimes. Here's the question from Rookie 18, Joe. Where are the rest of the people for the RICO charge?
Listen, Rookie 18 makes a wonderful, wonderful point. I never thought that ninth grade English would come in handy 30 years later. But we used to do prefixes, and you had to define the prefixes. And one is con, C-O-N. That's with or together. So there's a conspiracy, but who is he conspiring with? Even at the beginning, when RICO first started getting, using prosecutions to get mobsters, et cetera, they never prosecuted those guys alone, but prosecute a whole lot of them, then maybe get some to sell out on other ones. So it's a very fair question. But they also know that sometimes when they put too many people up in here together, you end up having problems. The Young Thug case, I think, is a perfect example of that. On the other hand, they do the same thing with R. Kelly, with just R. Kelly, even though you're alleging conspiracy in RICO. Yeah. So that's a very fair question. And on the defense side, to the point that was made before, I think some of these stars will come in and say, yeah, I was there. I never saw this or that or the other. And it reminds the jury, well, I'm not saying he's not a domestic abuser, but he's hanging out with Michael B. Jordan or with Usher or, fill in the blank, whoever it is. And it might be a little freaky, but it's not criminal. Because if it was really criminal and if it was really a conspiracy, there'd be more than just him. And so I think that's a very fair question and something that the prosecution is going to have to make sure they explain really, really well. I think this is even more of a stretch, honestly, than even the Young Thug case, where at least it's showing up in their music and those types of things. So they might have a problem that way.
It was more easily digestible that there was a gang, right? As opposed to Combs operating his businesses. I mean, he's a famous guy. They could probably say, of course he's got security. Of course they have guns. Of course he's trying to protect himself. But the more like David James testifying yesterday, his former assistant, saying, it's Combs' kingdom. We got to take lie detector tests. We got to supply the rooms. Cassandra Ventura talking about assistants, cleaning up after the freak-offs, tracking her location. That's what they need to get to this as a criminal enterprise. It's interesting. It's interesting. Okay, this is talking interesting. Great question from Rel. Also, frequent contributor here on the live stream. I'll go to you with this, Florina. Does the evidence like text messages outweigh witness testimony? And I'll give you an example. I imagine Rel might be saying this because Cassandra Ventura takes the stand, says she was victimized, she was exploited by Sean Combs, that she did all of this without her consent, and yet there are messages from her to him where she's encouraging freak-offs, asking for freak-offs, complying with freak-offs, setting up the freak-offs. Text messages outweigh witness testimony? What do you think?
The text messages certainly question the credibility of the witness testimony, but you have to remember that this is a relationship that spanned more than a decade. And so, as one would expect, in a decade of time, you're going to have periods of time where maybe she consented, and then you're going to have periods of time where she did not want this. And the psychologist's testimony is where I think it's going to tie together an explanation for why somebody may appear to be consenting via text message, but really still be traumatized, abused, and not really consenting. But I think those text messages are great fodder for cross-examination and an opportunity for the defense attorneys to question her credibility.
But the prosecution knew about it. They knew about these messages, and they put her on the stand. They put this case forward. I wonder if the jury says, it's not like this was a surprise. The prosecution knew it, meaning maybe it doesn't matter as much. Maybe we're looking too much into it. The prosecution's not worried about it. What do you think?
Well, why are they calling the psychologist, right? They're worried about it
that's
enough to need an expert opinion to explain it away.
Okay.
And I think anybody would wonder, well, if you're saying this is okay in text message, why are you now at trial saying you never agreed to this and it's not okay?
Good point. Good point. That's why okay, so they might, yeah, that's a good point. The jury could be saying, oh, they need to call a psychologist to explain this. That's a good point. All right. Oh, this is great. We have a super chat question from Nest Dog, who's also been a frequent contributor for these live shows. Nest Dog, thank you so much for your support. Jeremy, I'll throw this to you. Doesn't his assistant count towards RICO? I'm assuming they're talking about David James, who I mentioned before. Doesn't his assistant count towards RICO?
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the key elements of a RICO charge, you have to have sort of a formal organization, which could also be sort of an informal group of people, which you have with people who are engaging in these freak offs. There has to be some pattern of racketeering activity, which would include drugs, gun violence, sex trafficking, which clearly there's evidence of that, at least from the testimony. And then a connection to some sort of enterprise, right, where, Diddy or whoever his assistant was. And by the way, the conspiracy piece on this could also be connected back to some of the victims who were testifying. I think that's why the testimony of the psychologist is so important, because ultimately, if the person testifying for the prosecution was not testifying, there might be a chance that they might be brought as a defendant in this case. So I think it's interesting. The other point I want to mention too is when you compare this to, I think Joe and Florina both mentioned this, when you look at the R. Kelly case and the Ghislaine Maxwell cases, both of them received 30 years for sex trafficking and RICO violations, at least R. Kelly did, and Miss Maxwell received 20 years on track. So just for perspective.
Yeah, and people made the same criticism of Ghislaine Maxwell. Who did she traffic all these minors to? Right, because they're not part of the case. All right, we got an update from court. Dr. Hughes testifies. This is a different role. Sean Combs' defense counsel says, you have not gathered information about this case, right? I am not rendering an opinion on any individual. There's someone named Cassie, but you don't know what she said, right? I don't. You testified across the river in the Eastern District of New York, right? Right. And you say the same thing, even in the cases are different, correct? It's to help the jurors understand, but it's their job to consider their case, right? See, Joe, that's so important, right? I don't believe she was permitted to testify specifically about Cassandra Ventura because she didn't examine her. She's providing these overarching concepts for the jury to understand. Is this good cross-examination?
I think it is good cross-examination because the defense, to win this case, you're going to have to do a whole lot of sideswiping. You're going to have to be able to undermine what even a credible or likable witness is saying by being able to establish in this particular case, well, you didn't test her, so we really shouldn't be listening to you at all, right? Or that this situation is so distinguishable from what you normally dealt with, from what you dealt with before. And by the way, because it's distinguishable, but you're saying the same thing in two different cases, then you shouldn't be believed anyway. So if an unlikable witness you can attack, a witness that's not likable, you can sideswipe them and say, well, regardless of what you're saying, it doesn't really apply here for this reason, that reason, either because of something you didn't do or because something wasn't done underlying, or we're talking apples and oranges. So I think it is important from a cross-examination standpoint because all of these witnesses that come in with something that has a potential to bear negatively on Sean Combs, particularly making the dots connect about why someone would stay in a relationship and this becomes potentially a criminal thing, keeps him in the game for it, you've got to undermine him somehow.
The cross-examination is continuing. So Sean Combs' defense counsel asks, You don't publish data on the patients you have evaluated, do you? Dr. Hughes says it's confidential, so I can't cross-check your experience, the basis of what you're saying, right? Okay, we got a super chat question from Nate. Nate, thank you so much. I'll throw it to you, Florina. Do you think that Cassie's testimony helped them swing the case towards the prosecution? Also, has other celebrities come out about the case?
Well, she is the star witness for the prosecution. Certainly the detailed accounts of abuse and the episodes of him beating her and what he was doing to her was compelling. But, you know, this is the beginning of a long road, and we await to see where it goes and what the other witnesses will say and what witnesses the defense may potentially put on to rebut what Cassie said. You have to remember that this is an ongoing, lengthy relationship over many years with these alleged violent acts and sex parties that she may or may not have consented to. It's the prosecution's position that she didn't. She testified that she didn't, but there's some evidence to suggest that maybe she was either coerced to do this, which would support the prosecution, or that she was a willing participant that wanted to be in a relationship with him.
And have other celebrities come out about the case? I mean, not as many as we thought originally when the allegations came forward. Sure, you had Dawn Richard take the stand, right? You had Kerry Morgan, celebrity. I mean, Kid Cudi's about to testify, but I don't think we're going to get J-Lo on the stand, right?
Right. I don't think this is going to be Jeffrey Epstein level sex allegations with a litany of celebrities suddenly coming forward. We also know from the civil lawsuits that were filed who the potential pool of witnesses may be. And like in any federal criminal case, the prosecution has to exchange their witness list ahead of time. And so if somebody's not on that list, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to suddenly bring somebody in that has not yet been disclosed on that list.
Jeremy, going to you. Question from Spencer Campbell. Aren't many of his ex-employees testifying against him? Wouldn't these people be considered conspiracy or who he's conspiring with?
Yes, potentially, especially if the prosecution can prove that they were a part of these discussions and or the planning that was going into some of these freak-offs. But that being said, similar to the victim's testimony, it really has to be able to show that they weren't coerced into doing this, they weren't held at gunpoint or felt threatened or under duress, that sort of thing. So yes, they can be considered part of it, but again, there's two sides to that coin.
So Joe, this is a good question from Words 789. Will Diddy's apology video be used as evidence? And that's the video came out 2 days after CNN published the 2016 footage of him appearing to beat up Cassandra Ventura, where he apologized. And you wonder from a legal point of view why he did it, because he's essentially admitting it's him on the tape. It's not as if the tape was doctored. He admitted it was basically him. I don't think it's been admitted yet, right? I could be wrong, but I don't think so. And why wasn't it admitted during Cassandra Ventura's testimony? Do you think it's going to be admitted?
I don't believe it has been either. And of course, the defense would fight like heck to keep it from getting in. I would argue it's more prejudicial than probative. It doesn't accomplish anything. It reminds it knocks on the door once again for the prosecution to say, jury, hey, this guy's really a criminal. But the fact of the matter is he's acknowledging being a domestic abuser. That's what the video is about. So it's really repetitive. Once the tape came in, we know what he did. Once the tape came in, him apologizing for the tape, he's not acknowledging that he's a sex trafficker. He's not acknowledging that he should be guilty of RICO. He's not acknowledging that there's a conspiracy. He didn't say me and a bunch of other guys did it. You know what I mean? So they'll fight like heck to keep it from coming in. I'm pretty sure it's not in yet. But I would argue that it's just more redundant than anything because it continues to knock on the door and remind the jury. They still have to make that step, though, to making it a criminal conspiracy. And the video acknowledges that he's a domestic abuser. That's why they ran to that in opening and said, we own that he's a domestic abuser and it's not cool. That's why he ran to that, because now this is redundant and doesn't add anything.
Yeah, there's not much more they can go. I mean, they can't deny what everybody sees in that video. Although, here's what's interesting. Now we go back to the cross-examination that's happening in real time of Dr. Dawn Hughes. Again, this witness called by the prosecution to explain why perhaps somebody in Cassandra Ventura's position would have stayed with her alleged abuser, Sean Diddy Combs, despite everything that she claimed is happening to him. Happening to her. So, Jeremy, I'll go to you. Sean Combs' defense counsel asks her, people might go to a civil lawyer to make a little money, right? There's an objection from the prosecution. The judge says, let's move on. He says, in civil litigation, you might look for malingering, right? Where that's somebody who fakes their symptoms. What are we taking away from that line of questioning?
I think that the defense counsel is trying to poke holes in the sort of expert testimony of this psychologist and her ability to make money in these cases, or her ability to get paid for these matters. But I think a jury, for the most part, will see past that. And again, the other side will have an opportunity to bring their own expert in to testify, and that person will also be cross-examined. I think, if anything, it's kind of what Joe was saying earlier, that ultimately the defense has to throw some things at the wall and kind of figure out what sticks. And I think poking holes in sort of this expert testimony, I think what it highlights too is the fact how important, again, this testimony is. Because Cassie stayed so long in the relationship, there has to be proof that she was under, some duress and some sort of psychological issues. And I think that's the point that's trying to be made.
I want to do a round robin answer here from every one of my guests. I'll go one at a time because we just got this super chat question from 1989 who actually paid in Swiss francs. So thank you so much for this contribution. First time we've seen that. Okay, I'll start with you, Florina. At this point, if you could put it in a percentage, will Sean Combs get convicted of something he's charged with?
I think there's a very high likelihood that he'll be convicted of something, 75% or more.
Of what charge?
That's a good question.
Transportation to engage in prostitution?
I think at a minimum, with what the evidence is so far, transportation to engage in prostitution is a likely conviction. Because
that's pretty straightforward. It's transporting people for the purposes of prostitution.
Right. And the evidence is that he was paying people as escorts, paying people to engage in sex acts, and providing the transportation for that to happen.
Joe, percentage. At this point, if you could put in percentage, will Sean Combs get convicted of something he's charged with?
I would put it at 50-50. There's something that doesn't make sense with Sean Combs. Frankly, he should have gotten convicted years ago with the Shine case. And he threw Shine under the bus. Shine did hard time. I had a conversation with my mother, and she let me know that, Joe, I'd have real concerns about this because of the passage of time. And will the jury, be able to separate all of these crimes, right, the way that they need to? If they are, like what was just said, then maybe they get there at transportation, right? But I'd say 50-50 right now, because my sense is I think it could be an all or nothing proposition, because there's something about him and New York City that it may be that somebody might be there, particularly with 8 males on the jury, to hang that jury.
You just need one. Before I go to the poll that we have up, and very interesting poll, Jeremy, your percentage.
So I have the 3 charges, right? Sex trafficking, racketeering, and drug distribution or firearm. 100% on drug distribution and firearm offenses. I don't think there's any doubt there, particularly with the shaved off numbers on the guns.
Well, he's not individually charged with those. They're part of the racketeering case.
Right. And then I think the racketeering piece, I would say 75%, just based on comparing it to other cases with R. Kelly and Miss Maxwell. I'd say 75%.
Okay, here's the poll, okay? How impactful do you think expert psychological testimony has on understanding the case? Who's ready for this? 80% say very impactful. 20% say not impactful. Quite the number, Florina.
I'm not surprised at all because on its face, the testimony is not very believable when you have delayed disclosures, when you have behavior that suggests that somebody is okay with this kind of behavior. And so the cycle of abuse needs to be explained by an expert. And when you have someone who's supposedly objective, somebody who doesn't have any bias, someone who's not really friends with or related to either side coming in and lending their expertise to explain what is common in that field, here being the field of psychology,
right,
it tends to be very helpful.
Got a super chat question again from Nate. Nate, thank you so much. Jeremy, I'll throw this to you. Do you think with Cassie being pregnant, it's going to sway the jury? And do they think that he would get a life sentence or just a slap on the wrist if he's convicted?
Sure. So, there may be, jurors are not without emotion. So clearly they can see people, they're seeing people in person, and you can have a reaction. I think there is definitely an opportunity for that. As far as, how much time he'll get, again, I think it's probably more like if he's convicted, 30 years to life. And with his age, he'll probably spend the rest of his time in prison. And as Florina talked about earlier, there's very little wiggle room on the federal charges, and there's generally not any parole opportunities. You can have supervised release. So my guess is around 30 years to life.
Okay, we got an update from court. So Sean Combs' defense attorney says, you gave a webinar about giving expert witness testimony, right? Again, questioning Dr. Dawn Hughes. Dr. Hughes responds, yes, for battered women. Let me show you DX, and then the judge calls for a sidebar. Joe, what are you getting from the cross-examination? What is the theme of the cross-examination right now?
Yeah, I think they want to undermine his credibility, because I think that they're going to try to show that, you're doing webinars, you're coaching battered women, you're coaching people, you're letting the jury know, you're letting the lawyers that hire you know that you're going to come in and do whatever needs to be done for this person in this category, which on some level may be true for all experts, but they want to undermine the basis and the window that he comes through. So if they can say the window that this expert witness comes through is always one that's going to support this person, despite what may be some people's notions of common sense, then they can't be trusted. Because fundamentally, again, they want the defense to get back to the place, the jury to get back to the place where they would say, my first inclination is this looks voluntary and it's a long, long time. How do you get past that? So hopefully they're using that witness on the cross to flip back to that and to get back to people's notions of common sense based on their own experience. Again, this is very unusual.
Question from Rel for you, Florina. Why do the feds keep bringing up weapons, but they didn't charge Diddy with weapons violations? That's a great question, because they could have easily at the federal level charged him with possession of weapons regarding the serial numbers and things of that nature. They didn't. Why not?
Well, it's a fact that's part of the racketeering charge,
Correct.
so they do need it as evidence to support the racketeering charge. Without those weapons, the racketeering charge falls. Why didn't they charge it as its own charge, like possession of the weapon,
Yeah.
the weapon being illegal? Oftentimes, they don't charge the weapon individually. That's something we see in state cases
Sure.
as criminal possession of a weapon. They will charge weapons charges as its own thing in federal court when it's part of sex trafficking or part of drug distribution, or when the weapon itself was being used. So a gun that was fired, or when it's a weapon that has been altered to have maybe a larger capacity than what's legal, automatic weapons, machine guns, things like that. And also when we're talking about weapons in large quantities. I think none of that applies here, and really it's just a prejudicial fact that's going to be used against him, and it's also a fact that's going to be used to support the ultimate racketeering charge.
Got a question from Jesse K. I'll throw this to you, Jeremy. Serious question. How can someone not get mad hearing the defense basically suggesting that Cassie and possibly other victims faked their symptoms after seeing these injuries? I think this goes to the question for Dr. Dawn Hughes about, was it possible that people malinger, right, fake the symptoms of being abused or being victims? That's a fair question. Could the jury be upset at hearing this line of questioning?
Maybe, but I think ultimately most juries, even non-lawyers, would understand the point that the defense is trying to make a case, and ultimately, I think it's fair from a defense standpoint to point out that somebody stayed that long in a relationship, one, but two, potentially also helped organize, and there's evidence of that, some of these freak offs, right? So I think it's fair questioning, but I think it also highlights the difficult job that prosecutors and defense lawyers have in these types of cases. Because no matter what, you're going to have some people on one side saying that took it too far, and the other people on the other side saying they didn't take it far enough. So,
well, I'll tell you, for that lack of consensus, got a question for you, Florina, from Never Be. What happens if the jury's hung?
If the jury is hung, then it's case over, and then the prosecution has the option to retry the case if they want to. Most of the time, they retry it, unless they hear that they were hung, let's say 11-1 in favor of the defense, because when they're hung, they can find out what the numbers were, how many for the prosecution, how many for the defense. I've seen cases where sometimes when they're heavily skewed for the defense and hung by one person for the prosecution does not retry it. But certainly they can, and most of the time they do.
Or if it's 11-1 in the other direction, right? Okay, so we have a question here from Mikey John. I'll throw this to you, Joe. Law and Crime Network, thank you everyone for the great answers. One more question. Will Christina Coram, who as we know is Combs, or apparently Combs' former chief of staff, will Christina Coram be put on the stand? And if so, for the defense or for the prosecution? Joe.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I forget how that, how she was being talked about, right? I think the same thing that can make you laugh will make you cry. If she was going to be central, what the prosecution needs that they don't have, Cassie is the quote star witness, but she was in love. And a lot of times it's almost like she kind of didn't know what was going on, right? Or at least it can be perceived that way. And if that's the case, then how do you know that this isn't voluntary? How do you know this? What they need is someone in that position. And I don't know if this chief of staff would give them this information. The prosecution would do it. They would have said so probably in opening if they would. Somebody that is very clear-headed and saying, Diddy, Mr. Combs, you can't do this. I witnessed some things. I was scared to talk about him because I knew that they were wrong. He went to another place. Somebody that can really, in a clear-headed fashion, really help put the conspiracy together, put the criminal element together. If the chief of staff can do that, then yeah, I'd be looking at it. But I don't think we've heard that that's going to happen. And I would imagine that if the defense could use the chief of staff, who is somebody who is very close to things by the nature of their job, to say anything positive, I think the defense will be more likely to use that person for that very reason.
Her name came up already in prior testimony, where it was that she would call to try to find out where Cassandra Ventura was. Again, if we're talking about Cassandra Ventura being an alleged victim of sex trafficking, to have one of his assistants try to keep tabs on her and find out where she is, obviously that helps with the racketeering charge. We got a super chat question from Lawyer Batty. Thank you so much for this, the contribution. Really appreciate it. I'll go to you, Jeremy, with this one. What would be the fundamental differences between Ghislaine and Cassie if both were willing participants who aided in the process? That's an interesting comparison to make, but you go first, Jeremy, and then I'll give you my opinion.
Well, again, I think as long as there's, evidence to show that they were sort of engaging in sort of helping the relationships to move forward, organizing these sex activities. But again, Cassie is going to be shielded from that as a victim, right? And ultimately, I think the prosecution's case is going to be essential to her testimony and, or at least to her, to what she provided and what the evidence is. But I don't know so much of a comparison can be made there. Again, I think I would go back to the expert and to what Cassie has said as to proving the prosecution's case.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think you can make the comparison between the two because Cassandra Ventura is not being characterized as a willing participant in further criminal activities, you know, like she's part of kidnapping and forced labor and arson, whereas Ghislaine Maxwell was accused and ultimately convicted of being a key participant in the trafficking of people to other individuals. And, you know, they're saying Cassandra Ventura is a victim of that, and she can't be a conspirator in her own victimhood unless you try to say she was instrumental in transporting prostitutes for purposes of prostitution. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Okay, update from court. The judge says, jurors, we're going to send you to the jury room for a bit. All rise. The jurors leave. The judge says, yesterday, Ms. Shapiro, who's one of the defense counsel, submitted an exhibit ex parte. Now reviewing a document, what should I focus on? Prosecutor says it shouldn't show this witness has a bias. Interesting. Again, talking about Dr. Dawn Hughes. Got a question for you, Florina, from Lotus Flower. Do you think they can call Suge Knight since Cassie spoke about the incident with him? Diddy going after him with 3 guns in his lap?
Can they potentially? Maybe. If the testimony were to show something that would attack the credibility of another witness, then they could call him to impeach that credibility. The big question is whether or not that witness was disclosed on the witness list. And if the witness was not disclosed on the witness list previously, they would need a compelling reason for the late disclosure to call the person, not for the prosecution's case, but on rebuttal.
This is an interesting question from Chris Buono. I'll throw it to you, Joe. How would a witness sit with the jury if they take the stand as a hostile witness and then take the fifth?
Well, that's always interesting. It actually depends on who the witness is, right? And what, you know, the questioning attorney who's put them on as a hostile witness. So going through that scenario, that means somebody was supposed to be called or was supposed to testify way X or way Y, and they didn't, or they refused to, right? And so therefore, you're going to put them on as a hostile witness. Now they're going to take the fifth. Well, that could be good news and bad news for the prosecution, because could the jury be saying, well, prosecution, why aren't you prosecuting this person as well? And if you're looking for a hostile witness to give you what you need, that must mean that your case, as it pertains to people that are not either being called hostilely, even if they're not, you know, excited, exuberant witnesses, that means your case isn't tight enough. You need a hostile witness, somebody that's not saying what it is that they need to, and so therefore you want to wring it out of them in order for you to get your conviction. So I think it would be a bit distracting if someone is coming on and they're not cooperating, because it might say that you took this chance because there are weaknesses in your case.
Jeremy, got a question from Soul Shadow. A name that keeps coming up over and over is D-Rock. So this is one of his members of the security team. Do you think he's going to be called to testify too?
You know, again, as Florina mentioned, unless it was on the witness list, no, unless there's a compelling reason to do that. But again, I think if it's similar to Kaplan's situation where he's provided immunity, you know, I think you can bring him on the stand and just make sure that he's providing, you know, whatever details he can so he's not prosecuted against, right?
Are you talking about Mr.
James?
You're talking about Mr. James, the assistant from yesterday?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Because he was offered a proffer agreement.
Right. So some level of protection to get him up there. But again, unless he's on the witness list, unlikely unless there's a compelling reason. And if he does, he would, you know, ultimately any lawyer would tell him, don't take the stand unless you've clearly gotten some level of protection there.
Yeah, because again, I think he could be instrumental in the racketeering charge, and especially if he witnessed or was furthering any of the alleged abuse of Cassandra Ventura. Got a question for you, Joe, from Danny. So what were all of the known evidence found during the raid? What did they find during the raids of his property? We talked about it a little bit more earlier with Elizabeth.
we've talked about that some, but talked about sex, drugs, rock and roll. I mean, all kinds of stuff. They found cocaine on dollar bills. They found scratched off guns. They found things that would seem to be that would indicate potential criminal activity. For instance,
Cell phones in the shoes.
Cell phones and shoes. Scrapped off serial numbers off of guns when people want to do something using a gun and get away with it, right? And have it be under the radar. So a lot of things that may indicate there are things going on that are unseemly, right? Whole lot of high heels and shoes, a whole lot of
baby oil, personal lubricant,
a whole lot of things,
ammunition
that are the instrumentalities of the freak off, as it were. But I think it might be a little bit more powerful that the things that people traditionally associate with crimes are being found. Things related to guns.
We had a poll go up. Does the evidence found during the raid on Diddy's Miami mansion strengthen the prosecution's case? 83% say yes, 17% say no. I got another update from court. The judge says she can be shown the document. So again, this is Dr. Dawn Hughes. She can be shown the document about training domestic violence advocates and asked if she remembers, but I won't admit it as evidence until she denied it and it becomes a prior inconsistent statement. So something that would challenge her credibility. I'm going to go to you, Florina, with a question from Mary O'Connell. Will Diddy be taking the stand?
That is a great question. The unfortunate answer is we really don't know until it happens. Oftentimes, even the defendant's attorney does not know until it happens. It's really not a decision that can be made until the prosecution rests. And then it's going to be a question of, does the defense believe that the prosecution met their burden and put on enough evidence, in which case the defense needs to put something on as a Hail Mary to raise questions and raise doubt? Or does the defense believe that they did a good enough job of attacking all those witnesses through cross-examination and can credibly argue that the prosecution failed to meet their burden of proof and there's not sufficient evidence to convict, and therefore there really is no need to put on any witnesses, Diddy or others, because the prosecution just didn't do a good enough job. Remember, the burden of proof is always with the prosecution. So if the prosecution fails, the defense doesn't need to do anything. If the prosecution does a damn good job, the defense has a problem. Their Hail Mary may be him testifying.
Joe, Jeremy, do either of you 100% believe that Diddy's going to take the stand? I've spoken to people who are like, he's definitely going to do it. Do either of you believe he's definitely going to take the stand, or do you, kind of have that reasonable interpretation, as Florina had mentioned?
I don't believe he will, because he's the heart and soul of New York at his best. There's no way he's going to get on the stand and look better. He's got to rely on his presentation and how people feel about him to give him the benefit of the doubt based on the evidence. He doesn't have to get on the stand for that to happen.
Jeremy, I'll give you the final word on it.
Absolutely not. I don't think there's a chance that he takes the stand. There's no way. I think psychologically he's not in the right place. And I think ultimately, I don't think the jury would have any sympathy with him.
Yeah, I think it might hurt his case more than help his case. Although, listen, he testified in his prior trial 25 years ago. Very different circumstances than we have here. He also made the apology video on Instagram. So who knows it's his decision alone. But I tell you what, it was a great discussion that we had today. Florina Altshiler, Jeremy Evans, Joe Richardson, thank you all for coming on and breaking down the nuances of this case, the updates in this case, and also, of course, all of our viewer questions. Thank you to you three.
Thanks much.
You.
All right, so before I let you guys go, and thank you so much for all of your fantastic questions, I just want to let you know we plan on keep on doing these lunchtime shows for you as much as we possibly can. And the reason we can do it is because we have the support of our incredible sponsor and partner, Morgan & Morgan. This is great. Now, if you don't know who they are, they're America's largest personal injury firm. They have an amazing track record. I'll give you an example. So in the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $6 million verdict for a car crash victim in Florida, $13 million for a wrongful auto death in Georgia, and another $6 million for a trucking accident in New York. And mind you, All of this was after insurance offered their clients significantly less in each of these cases. And even if you're listening to this and thinking that your case is not worth millions of dollars, why not just start a claim and fight for what you deserve? You see, the thing about it is, Morgan & Morgan, they make it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LCLive by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on screen. So that wraps it up here, but before we let you go, I also want to let you know we have all of these sidebars coming out later. We're going to do a live hit with Elizabeth Milner. She is going to give us a full breakdown of everything that happened in the courtroom. We're also going to be talking about, has the prosecution really proved the racketeering charge? A lot more we have to talk about. Oh, we got a sidebar coming out about Jonathan Oddie as well. Check it out. Check out all of our coverage on Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks so much.